Hey folks, I'm Chuck Black. We're doing 52 weeks of Python. Technically, we've finished 52 weeks. I'm doing some extra lessons by popular demand or maybe just because I felt like it. So we are doing week number 53 and the topic is going to be Swagger. What is Swagger? Swagger is also known as Open API. It's basically a definition that allows documentation to be automatically generated for your Restful APIs. So like the APIs that we've been using in this class, hosts, devices, services, traceroute, port scan, etc. What would it be like if we could provide some documentation that said how these worked? Well, the good news is Swagger allows us to do that, and that's what we will be talking about, both how this gets generated, what it is. You can see it's just another user interface on top of our existing REST service that we built inside Flask. There's going to be code that we look at, so we will be modifying the code. We actually will be changing from using just functions to using classes, but it becomes a little bit clearer. We'll use these annotations to specify input parameters as well as output, what to expect if it's successful and if it's not successful, etc. So that's what we will be talking about. Without further ado, let's get started. So let's talk about auto-generated RESTful API documentation. So as you know, our Quokka project, as we left it, looks something like this. It actually has more stuff going on than that, but I wanted to show you this one just so that you can see there's this user interface here, and this user interface looks something like this. And if you recall from our discussions earlier, this screen is rendered using two web services. One is this React npm start Node.js material UI plus some code that I've written thing that is running HTML, JavaScript, etc. And it is resulting in the framework of pages like this getting rendered, plus the ability to toggle between different screens, etc. But that is one of the web services. The other web service that's actually running is the Quokka thing that we've been spending 52 weeks or whatever building. And this is implemented inside Flask. We're using Python. We're using a database. We're talking to devices and hosts and services in the network. We actually even implemented messaging. So we have some workers going on. So there's two of these things actually going on in order to have this type of user interface that's built on top of it. Now, you may be curious, and that is the subject of our discussion, is how can you make known what the API is, what this RESTful API is? Why do you want that? Well, we saw this ourselves. I started by building a host display that was terminal based. Remember that? And then I built device and service displays that were both running inside a terminal or a CLI type window. And then all I did was I built a user interface on top of it, but I didn't have to change this in order to do that. In other words, the REST API stayed the same. So in the same way that effectively there were two implementations of the user interface, one being these terminal based and one being the actual full-blown front end, there may be somebody else who wants to come in and either get at our data or get at functionality in order to present their own user interface. So wouldn't it be nice to be able to publish what this RESTful API is all about? And the answer is yes. It would be nice to be able to do that. And the better news is it's possible to do that using something that has traditionally been named Swagger, because that was the name of the project under which it was originally developed. It's now called Open API, but people still refer to it in common language as Swagger. You can see there's even something that says Swagger right there. So the API specification exists, Open API, but we call it Swagger, and I'll probably end up calling it Swagger just because that's what I'm used to. The general idea is to end up with something like this. This should look somewhat familiar to you. /devices, /hosts, /services. Those are the first things we implemented. Then we implemented port scans, and you can see those endpoints right there, and traceroute. And this is for the workers to communicate with us. Wouldn't it be nice not only to know that these exist, but to know what they actually do? And I can click on this for, say, get hosts, and it will pop open and it will tell me this is actually the result of something that I've done. It will tell me the parameters that I need to pass, which there aren't any. I can click on this thing that says try it out. You may think that try it out means actually do it, but it just means get ready to do it. I'm going to do a clear here to get rid of what was there before. And so now you see there's no output. This is what I probably should have showed you at the beginning. You open this and it tells you what the parameters are. There are none. It tells you what the possible response codes are, and it gives you an example of what this data might look like. And as you can see, it's a dictionary of dictionaries with host name and then a bunch of fields for every host. I can now, since I've said try it out, I can click execute, and what it will do is it will go out and perform that function. And if I scroll down, you can actually see the response from the server to it. I got a 200 response code back, and here's the data that I got back. So I'm able to exercise this. This is like my own user interface into the data that we have here via the Flask server and stored in the database, etc. And I've done this for hosts. I could do that for devices. I could say get devices. I come here, say try it out. I say execute. It executes it, and here's the results of this. And I can see that I have 2 devices, and here's the information about my 2 devices. I can furthermore actually do something like I could add something. If I go to hosts, let's look at put. Here put set tells me some information. First of all, it tells me the payload. I'm not sure why it does this first, but this is the JSON data that it will be expecting me to give it, something like that. And I need to provide a parameter, which is the host name. That would be the host that I'm going to add or update. And I can actually create this and send it out and have the response come back whether it was added or not. We'll look a little bit more in detail at this a little bit later. But the question is, how can you achieve something like this? It looks pretty handy and cool and useful to somebody who's exercising the code. How do you actually create that? And that is what we're going to look at now. By the way, just so that we're clear, this is what we're talking about when we talk about this Swagger user interface. It's basically another user interface that is accessing the REST APIs that we built into our Quokka server. So this Swagger thing is that you see over here on the right is basically another module or another application or piece of functionality that's actually accessing these REST APIs and getting access to the database, triggering trace routes or port scans, adding new hosts, retrieving host services, devices, etc. That's where it fits in this picture. So what code changes did I have to make in order to get this nice documentation stuff to work? Well, that's what I'm going to walk you through right now. Now, I created an entirely new module called M11, and I copied the Quokka from the previous module 10 into module 11, and I started from there. And the only thing that I modified was Quokka server, which we're looking at right there. And then I had to create this file right here, which actually, as you can see, has a lot of stuff in it. That is 100% documentation stuff. So it's not actually code that causes functionality to happen in the product, but it's code that causes documentation to happen. So I put it out here in API doc models. You may run into something where people use the term API doc. That typically refers to REST documentation. It's a word that's been used in the past, and so that's why I called it API doc. And then models are the things that we defined. But let's look at the code. So in order to look at this code, the easiest thing to do is I went back to the module 10 version of Quokka server, and we're going to be looking at that. So I'm going to split that, put it on the right, and now we can look at both of these and see what the differences are. So let me just walk through this a little bit at a time. Now the first thing that you may notice is this line right here. So I am using another Flask-based library, and this library is called Flask underscore restx. Now let me just pause for a second. There's something called Flask Restful. There's something called Flask Rest Plus. And there are other Flask Rest packages out there. Flask Restful is the package that was built with support for Swagger in mind, and so that is what I've used actually in the past. But it turns out about two years ago now, the person that was supporting it just kind of went away and no longer supports it, no longer responds to any requests, etc. So what the bunch of folks who were using it did was they forked Flask Rest Plus and they created Flask Rest X as a branch, and so now that's the new one. So basically this is Flask Rest Plus that we're using with a little bit of additions. There's just a new version published in April of this year, 2021. So it is still being actively used. And so basically I'm going to be using that for defining my endpoints. It's going to change the way that we do stuff a little bit. So that's the first thing. Now this is something that I created purely on my own because I wanted this information, these API models, to not clutter up my Quokka server module. So that's why I did that, and you'll see that I went to a few pains just to try to make it simpler and easier to read. I hid all of that documentation dirty work up there. So that's the first thing that you'll notice. The next thing that you'll notice is potentially a very big thing. Let's get to our first definition of an endpoint. So this is over here on the right. This is how we did it before. We defined a function, and inside that function, we tested the request method. If it was a get, we did one thing. If it was a put, we did the other thing. And furthermore, we had to specify what methods are supported for that particular endpoint. It's done differently now, and if you're not an object-oriented software developer, you may chafe at seeing this, but it really is quite easy, so don't worry about it too much. There's some of you that may say, I don't know why you didn't do this in the first place, and that may be a legitimate argument. So let's just look at this host endpoint. Here's my host endpoint class, and you see API route. I only have to define the actual URL portion that I'm going to be referring to, /hosts, same as there. And now instead of having an if statement, within my class I define two methods. One of my methods is called get, the other method is called put. And as an intelligent human being, you can probably say, oh, well, that saves you from having to do this and having to do that and having to do that. And that's entirely correct. That is basically what we have here. In fact, if I was to simplify this as much as possible, I could just get rid of these things for right now. I'm going to put them back, of course, because they're important. But you can see this is basically the same thing as what I have over there, okay? So it's still, the functionality is the same. Return get all hosts, return get all hosts. Hostname equals get the request argument hostname. Everything else is exactly the same. The only difference is going to be these decorators that I have in the code. A decorator, as I hope you remember, I hope I made a good enough point of this, is something that starts with an @ sign, and it basically gives a clue to the compiler, because Python, of course, we think of it as an interpreted language, but the actual code has to be compiled, and it goes through a compilation step and gets compiled into bytecode. But I'm getting off track here. The decorators help the compiler to know what is actually going on here, and it associates this information with the thing that follows. So for this get statement, what it's basically saying is that I'm expecting a response of 200, and that means success. I can put anything I want in there. Oh, and by the way, this is the data that's going to get returned. Now, API models.hostResponse, That is something that I have defined myself, and we'll look at that in a minute. But it is the thing that allows us to be able to, let's see, we're in the hosts get. That allows me to have something, let me clear this. It allows me to print out, this is an example of what I get back. So basically that API docs host response includes this example, including the fields and whether they're strings or not, and sample data. So that is what that is telling the Flask REST-X. In addition to that, you can see on my put method, I have a response of 204, which is success. 204 means there's success, but I'm not sending any data back. 400 would be returned if I have inadequately provided hostname in my request. So there needs to be an argument called hostname. And if I've done it correctly for these other endpoints, then you'll see it's basically effectively the same exact thing that we're talking about here, is that I am providing information about the responses. And in my actual Swagger output here and input, of course, for getting hosts, there's nothing except for the output. But for putting hosts, then there's a couple things required. One is the host name, and that down here says, oh, you need to provide this host name. And then the payload is a JSON object, and it needs to follow this format. And I think I got all the fields in there. Here's just in a little tangential aside. Remember how we moved from SQL to Mongo because Mongo didn't require you to specify anything, any of these details? Guess what? I have to specify them for the documentation because humans that are going to use this are going to need that. So I actually had to recreate SQL-like stuff in my code. That's the API models in order to provide this documentation. It has zero bearing at this point in time on, and here I'm looking at devices, not hosts. It has zero bearing on the operation of the functionality, but it has significant bearing on what gets printed out right here to help the person using it create it. And by the way, if I wanted to add a host and I say try it out, look at what it does for me. It creates data. This is the data that I would be editing. And so I can edit this right here, and that becomes my JSON body that I put in. You can imagine it would be a pain in the neck to have to enter in all this stuff every time, but having this makes it really handy for me to add the appropriate data. Plus the host name, here I can add the host name that I'm going to add. And so this gets to be pretty handy for actually testing out your code. For somebody to learn what the APIs are, they can get an easy look at everything just by opening up the page and looking at this stuff. So anyway, getting back to the code, so you're going to see a lot of stuff like this, and this static method is just because these get and puts are static method. It saves there from being a warning so that I get the nice green check mark there. So for every one of these endpoints and for each of the methods, I'm actually going to have to define both the input parameters as well as the expected responses. Now, if I don't do that, it just doesn't show up here. It doesn't cause any major issues per se, except for the person trying to use it. So all of this is basically, think of this just as documentation. And that is for my services and hosts and devices. For scan, it's pretty similar. Remember, scan kind of goes in the opposite direction. I'm going to do a post first, and then I will get a token back, and then I can use that token when I make the response. So see, it's expecting a token. So here, I'll demonstrate this to you. We can see how this actually works in the real life situation. So let's see our Swagger documentation in action. I'm going to execute a scan on a particular device. So let's see how we would do that. Now, if I'm just thinking about the real world situation, I would want to basically see what I'm looking at in this table right here. I want to see all this information, and I could do it from there, but that would be cheating. I want to just use this. So I'm going to go to hosts, and I'm going to do a get on hosts. So I say execute, and now I have all of these hosts. So I have Lenovo Yoga Home, I have IP, I have Target, I have Host 49, I don't even know what that is. Unknown Roku streaming stick. I'm trying to think of which one. Why don't I choose this one? So I'm going to choose to do a scan on this right here. So I am going to copy that host name. I'm going to close this, and then I'm going to come down to scan. Remember, the first thing we would do with a scan is we do a post, because that is how we need to cause it to get initiated. And as you can see, what I can expect to get back is this token. What I need to pass in is this IP address. You can see it's giving me this can't do that. My mouse is changing to this international you can't do that symbol. That's because I haven't clicked try it out yet. So I'm going to say try it out. It wants my IP address or host name, and I'm going to paste that in, and now I'm going to do an execute. So now I've done the execute, and it's actually worked. It's performing this scan, or so it says. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to do my get on this. Now I want to keep this open because I need two pieces of data. For scan, I'm going to do a get. I want to try it out. Remember, I need to add in two pieces of data. One piece of data is going to be the host name. That's the target. And the second piece of data, this worked out handy that it was right there, is going to be this token. So I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to paste this. And now if the scan has completed, I should be able to say execute. And sure enough, I got a 200 back. And here is my port scan. So it's got the source my worker was running on, I called it Quokka. This is the target that I gave it. That's the token. The timestamp is when it was run. And the output is this thing right here. Now it turns out to be nicely formatted in the user interface that we use. But right here you can kind of get the idea of what it's all about. This is my scan output. You can imagine that a traceroute output is going to be a textual version of the binary picture that you see. But that is, in general, how you end up using this. So we've now done this. Let me now attempt to add a host to our list of hosts. I click on the put method for hosts. You can see it's giving me an example of what I would need to add in terms of the payload that will be added. And I'll also need to provide the host name. So I need to click on try it out to put it into a mode where I can edit it. I'm going to change the host name to X-Roku streaming stick. And I also, this is just the way that I built it, I also need to provide that host name in here. So now I've got it modified, and the streaming stick name has been changed, as well as the host name that I pass in here. Let's see if it works. It seems to have run. This is the curl command that it did. The server response was a 204, so it seems to have worked successfully. By the way, if you're interested in understanding how you could do this using curl, it does handily give you the curl command in total, so you can do that as well. Let's go check our hosts and see if it has been added. I'll get rid of that. I'll say get hosts. I've done this already. Let's clear what I had, and let's execute the command. It's going out and getting all the hosts, and let me scroll through here and see if I find, there's the Roku streaming stick. I'm assuming it will be at the end, so why don't I just go to the end? Whoops. Yeah, sure enough, there it is. X-Roku streaming stick home. That's the actual key. And then the host name is X-Roku streaming stick. Everything else I left the same. Probably a bad idea to have my database corrupted with that. I guess corrupted may be too strong a word, but to have that present in there. Let's see, I now have 26 devices in this list of devices, and if let's see, I don't see it there. Let me go back. Let me sort it by host name. If I go by host name, I should be able to see, there it is, X Roku streaming stick. It has the same IP address, etc., but it did appear. So yeah, that's good. Now you can actually see, here's two examples of two different user interfaces that actually are using and accessing the same data. Where's that picture that shows that? Both of these. Yeah, I've got a user interface, and then I could probably add Swagger up here as a means of going into that REST. In fact, I should do that. Maybe I'll add that to the beginning of this lesson. So you'll be looking at this, and I'll go back in time and make a change and add it to the lesson. Anyway, that explains how to add a host. So the last thing to discuss is this thing that I alluded to but then didn't describe earlier, this API models. This is a class that I created solely for the purpose of allowing things like this, which is an example of data that we get back from a get hosts, and like this, which is an example of what we pass in to create hosts, and things like this in our trace route. We get a token back, and we need to use that token then when we do a get, things of that nature. And of course, the same is true not only for hosts, but for devices and services as well. The question is, where does all of this stuff come from? Now, the thing that I want you to understand is that this is purely for documentation purposes. The way that we're using it, it has no effect on the operation of our Flask Quokka service. It is purely for documentation. And for that reason, I stuffed it away into a different module that I call API Doc Models. And I'm going to be importing this class, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and set everything, and I need to be passing in this API. This is why I need to set these values into the API so that it is available. And what's going to happen is when I set up with these decorators, when I specify what the response is going to be, like you see here, or what the parameter on a request is going to be, I reference my class, which is, for those of you that are interested and understand this stuff, it's a static class. Basically, that means there's the definition of the class and variables that go along with the definition, but we are not creating object instances of this class. There's just the data associated with the class definition, and we'll look at that in just a second. And we have dealt with this a little bit before, and I've described it. But the basic idea is that I reference this class, and then I reference the variable associated with that class. So there's a variable called host response that I'm referencing. Host fields, you'll see the same thing for device response and device fields. These are things that I pass in to this Swagger API functionality. And you can see that I've got stuff for service response and fields. I've got port scan data. I've got the token that we were looking at and that type of thing. So what I do is I declare, I import API models, tell Python where it's coming from, and then I call this method, which is going to pass in the API. And then what that's going to do when I say here, set API models, is it's going to go ahead and set host fields to the appropriate thing based on this API object that we got passed. That's the Swagger thing. And then the same is going to be true for device fields, and you will eventually see host response is going to look a little bit different. I don't want to go into all of the details. The general idea is that when I declare this thing, let's use host fields as an example, I'm going to say that it is going to be an API.model type of thing. And in the constructor for API.model, I pass in this name. and then I pass in what that actually data is going to be. This is like, if you remember from SQL Alchemy, we defined fields that would be actually columns in our table. It's the same way here. For my host, I'm going to have an IP address, a MAC address, a host name, a last heard, availability, response time. Those are basically the columns that hold the data for a host. And so we need to define them. I need to tell the Swagger, the API.model thing, that it's going to be of a particular type, and these need to all be string. I found a bug just a moment ago where things weren't working, and it was because I was trying to use these as Boolean and integer, and it turns out it didn't like that. So basically, when I changed everything to a string, it was okay. And here's the example values that you see popping up over here in Swagger, the same data. So it's statically defined data. This will always pop up there, but this is where I define basically the structure. And it is useful when I decide that I want to try it out. Let's say for putting of hosts, when I say I want to try it out, it's important that you get this right, or as right as possible, because this becomes editable. And if you recall, I ended up putting an X in front of one of these just to distinguish it from existing ones, and it allowed me not to have to type everything in. So that's what that stuff is. You don't have to become an expert in this. As I mentioned, it's purely for documentation via Swagger purposes. There's no other functional use for that stuff other than that. But it does make the output easier to understand, easier to actually execute things like a put for a host. So yeah, that's what API models is all about. So let's review what we talked about in this lesson. The topic of this lesson was Swagger, that is also called Open API. It is basically automatically generated documentation for your REST APIs, as you see here on the right. You can see all of the APIs. You can open these things up, and you can see what data you can expect to get back if you're doing something more involved, like updating a host or creating a new host. Then it tells you what you need to provide to the request. You can also try and execute it and see what happens to make sure that you're doing it correct and that it works appropriately. What do you have to do in the code in order to make that work? We talked about how we're using Flask RESTX, which is a branch from Flask REST Plus, and basically that requires us to do a few things. One of the things that we will be doing is we will be changing from doing a definition of a function, as you see here, and as we've done in the past, that's from our module 10, into defining classes for each of our sets of endpoints. So here you see the host endpoint, and we have a get and a put function, and we've done that for all of these services, endpoint, devices, endpoint, scan endpoints, etc. So we talked about how that works. There is information that we pass in for this API.doc. We pass in parameters, and it tells Swagger, when it generates the documentation, what we need to be providing, whether it's the JSON body or just a query parameter such as that. We've specified the expected responses, and these in turn appear down here where it says what their responses might be and what they mean. And so we do that for all of our endpoints and for every get and put individually. That helps people who are using our code to know what it is that they should expect, so that when somebody is seeing this nice output and says, I want to use that myself, then they can go and do basically what we're looking at right here, which is, instead of using the user interface that we're just looking at, or these individual command line programs that we run, we can run Swagger, and it goes into those same REST endpoints, and we can get and put data from those. So that's basically what we talked about. We did mention this thing called API models, which is purely of my own creation. It's exercising functionality that the Swagger tool needs, but it is not a special class or anything like that. It's just where I defined things like the host response and devices response, etc. So that's what this is all about. Swagger, it's pretty cool. You end up with this nice interface that you can use to exercise the code that you've created, and other people who might be wanting to be consumers of the code that you've created, your RESTful API, they can use this in order to exercise it and understand better how it works as well. If you have any questions, as always, let me know, and thanks for listening.